Hello and welcome back to Crushing Comics. My name is Peter and I'm your host as we're here to fall in love with my comic book collection all over again. I've already pre-selected what I am quite sure is an absolute edition off of the shelf. After last time I thought I had an absolute edition and then whiffed and actually had a Marvel omnibus. I think they're less dense than Marvel omnibuses. So we're going to get right into this book and see what Absolute has in store. Now, I have a pretty limited DC Comics collection, so there's only a few things that can be by process of elimination. I collected a fair amount of DC back in the 90s, but when I got back into collecting in 2010, DC's collection editions really were lagging behind Marvel's. They had a great amount of Absolutes, but I didn't start out collecting Marvel explicitly in hardcover. I actually started out trying to collect most Marvel in paperback. And so DC just didn't have as much coverage of series, especially of the 80s. They had a lot of coverage of recent series, and then a pretty good coverage of their Silver Age series, and there was really nothing for me. And so that's why I didn't start building my collection as DC. And so outside of Wonder Woman, I am much more apt to just have DC in digital. Let's see what we got. Ooh, okay. This is Sandman Absolute, Volume 2. It is a beautiful, beautiful book. Now, I have read Sandman Absolute Volume 1 and Volume 2 previously, and so I actually do know some things about this, but I don't think I know it so well in my mind that I can, distinguish where one ends and one begins. So I'll do my best to tell you some relevant stuff about Sandman. First, this will always bug me. I have a printing of this that doesn't have a terrific spine. It's hard to explain on video, but this is a very flat spine. It's not rounded well, and you'll see, I'll show you when we open the other Sandman spines, that they are more rounded. And as a result, I don't know what it is about the binding of this book, but it cracks a little bit. And I don't mean an audible crack, it's like you can kind of see into the gutters a little bit more in this edition than any of the other Absolutes, and it'll always bug me because they're such beautiful editions, and I just have this one that's like a bum print run. I guess they just did the binding a little bit differently in this one print run because these are books that DC keeps perpetually in print. And until further notice, unless you hear some kind of panic on them, if you see it out of stock somewhere, do not freak out. Do not run and pay a lot of money for it. It's going to be back. Just like the Hellboy Library editions, DC will continue to keep these in print. Look, even now it's bothering me. It's kind of like sagging a little. Anyway, I'm not the only person who's noticed this, but let's talk about the actual content of the book. So I actually want to start out by talking about something that's content that's just ahead of this book. This book, I think, begins with, I want to say issue 20? 21. But the big thing that had happened for Sandman was actually in issue 19, which was an issue that won the World Fantasy Award. And to that time, that was not an award that had been open to comic books. So you had this author, Neil Gaiman, who we all know him now, but he was not that well known at the time, and I'll get into that more when we open Volume 1, who was writing this series that was a very peculiar series that was unlike anything DC had done, even unlike the more kind of adult, abstract takes on Swamp Thing and Animal Man, because those still fundamentally starred the actual heroes, and Sandman was something quite different. And you had this outside body quite surprisingly saying, this is a work of literature in the fantasy genre. So people who had been reading Sandman understood this and knew this because Gaiman was expertly setting up, themes far beyond what we would typically see in a comic book. But now you had this outside body saying, oh yeah, it is definitely comic book literature. And so now you had people that didn't read comic books necessarily, or certainly weren't taking them as seriously, coming to Sandman to read the stories here. And that did something very transformative, not only for Sandman, but for the whole comic book industry. And you have to think about the time that these issues were being released to really put that in perspective. So this, these issues were coming out in the 1991 to 1992, 93 range. So this is at the same time as things like Claremont and Lee on X-Men, and heading into DC Comics doing Zero Hour, and Image Comics launching. This is the height of the speculation boom in comic books, which certainly helped Sandman drive up its prices and drive up its sales. But in terms of story, Sandman couldn't be any more different than those books. It was not about the cool artist. It was not about eye-catching art shoulder pads or naked ladies, although there was some nudity rather in Sandman. Sandman was about telling stories that really mattered, that had thematic content, and that actually tied to actual classic literature. And it's really interesting in that even though the Vertigo imprint existed at the beginning of Sandman and other books were being branded as Vertigo, in my mind at least, as a reader at the time, and even looking back in retrospect, I think of Sandman as a real watershed moment where there was this distinction of like grown-up comic books. Marvel had done that kind of thing in the 80s with their Epic line of comic book, Epic Illustrated, which were partially creator-owned, and it kind of fizzled. And now DC had Vertigo, and Marvel had really no distinct answer for that in the 90s. And Image certainly wasn't going after adult comic fans. It was going after speculators, but also people who just wanted to see cool, colorful stuff. So Vertigo kind of just had an open field to run down with this kind of content. And so there's this whole generation of readers who came for Sandman, but then wound up branching out into other series like Preacher, and kind of grew up reading these more adult comic books. And it took a long time for DC and Marvel to catch up with those readers, I would say, even until the 2000s, because Marvel's original teenage readers from the 90s and 80s were adults at that point. And that's when we started getting more nuanced, interesting stories from Marvel and DC. And I think DC definitely beat Marvel to the punch there. I think DC's mid-2000s stories were much more nuanced than Marvel's mid-2000s stories. But now it's hard to even draw a distinction about what comics are for kids, right? Everything reads as though it not necessarily has as much themes and as many mature ongoing developments in it as Sandman, but everything feels like it's for adults these days. So I know it sounds like I'm being a little bit evasive about talking about the stories, but again, I have a big distinction of what's at the beginning of Sandman, and much less of a distinction of what's in the middle of Sandman, because I read it all in one chunk. Other than to say, you start to see that even though there are distinct arcs here, that Gaiman is starting to take Sandman through a journey. And this is going to be something that's going to be a theme as we open these absolutes and bigger books, because I only happen to have absolutes and bigger books of these runs that characters really go on journeys. And this is where it really becomes, I think, starting to become evident that Sandman is not an ultimately ongoing comic book, and Gaiman is not going to be turning it over to anyone else, although we will see ultimately how that ends in Sandman Volume 4. So I'm going to put this one away right now. You know, like maybe one day I'll get another copy. It seems like such a waste to get like a whole other Absolute Edition, but it just drives me bonkers. The whole time I've been holding it, I can feel the spine sagging. And it's totally different than the other ones. Anyway, I could go on and on about that. So, I'm still happy to have it for content reasons, and I do think 2018 is going to be the year that I sit down to read all of Sandman, and in fact a lot of other classic runs. I'm kind of thinking that might be one of my resolutions for the new year, is to like sit down and read some classic runs. Right before the new year I sat down and read Grant Morrison's Animal Man, so it's time to really get educated about some of those classical works of comic books. So, without any further ado, this is Sandman Absolute, Volume 2, and it is headed for its ceremonial shelving. Here we go. Well, I have another volume up there. I don't know if it's going to fit. We're just going to put it right here for now. Thanks so much for watching another episode of Crushing Comics. Tune in next time as we continue our way through the remaining books on this wall, unwrapping and falling in love all over again. Thanks so much for watching.